Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Big Tent. Please put your Zoom into gallery mode in the upper right hand of your screen so you can see the entire panel. I hope everybody had a relaxing summer despite anxiety over voting rights, COVID, vaccines, infrastructure, Texas, climate change, and democracy in general. Well, we're here to help you navigate this wild political environment. Tonight, we're thrilled to welcome Joanna, Lydgate, and Norm Eisen, co-founders of States United Democracy Center. Joanna is the CEO of States United. She was previously Chief Deputy Attorney General of Massachusetts and was just selected as one of the 2021 top women of law by Massachusetts Lawyers Weekly. We're so lucky to have Joanna leading the States United team. Norm Eisen, the executive chair of States United, is familiar to everyone here from previous talks under the Big Tent and from his frequent appearances as a legal analyst for CNN. Norm founded Crew, was ethics czar for President Obama, and served as ambassador to the Czech Republic. Together, Joanna and Norm are providing nonpartisan support to many states where elections are under attack. And they are also doing a lot behind the scenes to safeguard our democracy. Before we get started, some announcements. Please save the evening of September 29th for Sarah Longwell and Bill Crystal from the Republican Accountability Project. They'll be here in our Zoom room at 7 p.m. Big Tent is partnering with Women's March Action to help galvanize women and men to join one of the many marches on October 2nd to protect women's reproductive rights. Stay tuned for more information on a women's march in your state. And we're having a tent talk with Emiliana Gurica of Women's March Action on October 19th at noon. There's a live transcript button at the bottom of your screen that will give you speech to text translation if you'd like it for the call. And please put your questions in the chat box, and Joanna and Norm will answer as many as they can. Joanna and Norm, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sue. It's so great to be with you all. I've been following your work closely for so many months, and I know we couldn't have better allies in this fight than all of you, and especially no better ally than Sue Mandel, who's one of my favorite people in the world. And I also just want to give a big shout out to Hank and Maggie, our amazing project assistants who've helped prepare this discussion today, and I think Maggie's going to be sharing her screen. We do have some slides for you all. So we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of who we are at States United, how we came to be, the work we do, the democracy threat that we are confronting right now, and we want to make sure to save a big chunk of time for your thoughts and questions. I know you have many of them, so we'll move through this as quickly as we can. And I just want to say thank you again for having us. Norm, I'll turn it to you.
Well, as a Big Tent veteran, I'm delighted to be back with you. As you know, I'm joining my friends in the Big Tent, having come through so much adversity together, always puts a smile on my face. And so pleased for you to get to know my co-pilot, our wonderful CEO, Joanna. The third member of the triumvirate is Governor Christy Todd Whitman. We'll have her come to a future Big Tent to visit us as well. She's my co-chair of the board. We could not have better partners in this fight, both in States United and in the person of all of you, with all of the things that the Big Tenters do, and excited to share a little bit about what we're doing tonight.
Great, so let's jump in. We're just gonna talk for a minute about our origin story, how we came to be, why we came to be. Before Norm and I joined forces, we're a little bit of an unlikely pair. We were both working in the democracy space, but doing different things. You all know Norm well. I was, as Sue said, the Deputy Attorney General for the state of Massachusetts. And in that role, I coordinated all of the state's major litigation. So criminal enforcement, consumer protection, civil rights, our work to hold opioid manufacturers accountable. And one of my key responsibilities once Trump took office was to coordinate all the multi-state litigation against the Trump administration and against their most problematic policies. So everything from the Muslim ban to the termination of DACA to family separation at the border to so many environmental rollbacks and much more. And as you all, I'm sure, know well, state attorneys general were really key to holding the line against the worst of the Trump administration's abuses. We won about 80% of those cases in court, and I absolutely loved my job. I planned to stay in it through the end of Attorney General Healey's term, and then came the summer of 2020, which I think we all remember well. And we were seeing really alarming rhetoric from then President Trump, attempts to weaken the US Postal Service. We were seeing threats of intimidation, voter intimidation at polling sites. And having spent years litigating against the Trump administration, I knew that the states would be on the front lines of really an unprecedented battle. And so it was really an all hands on deck moment. And Norm was sort of viewing the same thing play out from a different vantage point.
So for me, I remember exactly where I was when Trump tweeted about possibly delaying the election. I was sitting on this green couch that you can see somewhat blurred behind me. I had just finished the last chapter of my impeachment book, in which I predicted that Trump was going to get himself up to shenanigans. And it was not long after that that we realized that he was holding on to the ballots that Postmaster General Louis DeJoy was creating a bottleneck for the mail-in ballots. And one of the very first people who called me and said, Norm, what are you gonna do about this? Was our very own, our big tent resident, Sue Mandel. And States United really grew out of those initial concerns in the late summer of 2020.
So we decided, that the strategy was to create a go-to resource for state officials. And, you might be wondering, why state officials? State and local officials are really on the front lines of these threats. Elections are national events, but of course they're run at the state level. And states don't just run elections, they also uphold the rule of law. So governors, state attorneys general, secretaries of state, local election officials, they create the rules that govern our elections, they enforce those rules, they administer the elections, and of course, as we saw so vividly this cycle, they also work to protect the integrity of the results. But these, of course, are state government offices. And as I knew all too well, even in the best of circumstances, they are under-resourced. And this was really going to be an unprecedented fight, and we knew they would need backup. So we committed ourselves to providing those resources to the states, to connecting the states to one another, and really helping to address the extremely novel, to put it nicely, legal questions and communication strategies that arose during the 2020 election.
So with that analysis, and really shaped by Joanna's then boss, our common friend, Maura Healey, the other state AGs, other state officials, Joanna and I undertook the mission, which ultimately involved bringing together truly hundreds of people from coast to coast. The mission of working hand in hand with the under-resourced state officials. They're the most important. I knew from my work in the 2000 recount, I would go to court, everyone would arrive in court with a huge coterie of lawyers, and then the state officials would show up alone. If they were lucky, there was one person there to help take notes. So and yet they were central to election fights. So we decided that we would provide support and resources working hand in hand with the state officials in some of the most critical states across the country to provide legal communication and other forms of support, including organizing law enforcement officials, a critical but a much neglected group of leaders to help resist the coming onslaught on our democracy. And that was, as I say, really that all crystallized in August of 2020. And a lot had to do with that call I got from Sue. It like echoed, what are you gonna do about these ballots?
So just a few examples of our work and kind of what that looked like to support the states through this unprecedented election. Some of the things we focused on were, giving support to the litigation to stop the U.S. Postal Service from being sabotaged, putting together anti-voter intimidation toolkits for law enforcement leaders across the country to make sure that people had safe access to the polls, elevating strong voices in law enforcement like those of police chiefs across the country, getting them on TV, making sure people got the message that voter intimidation is illegal and would be prosecuted. And doing so much more alongside our incredible state officials, local officials, and law enforcement leaders. And of course, we made it through November. But if we thought we were done on election day, we were definitely wrong. And we really continued the fight all the way through January. So that included, publishing a report in the lead up to the Electoral College certification, rebutting claims that Mike Pence could overturn the results, outlining the criminal implications of Donald Trump's infamous now call to Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, sharing guidance on how to manage for law enforcement on how to manage demonstrations in the wake of the election, and of course, publishing a report about myths and lies related to the election to really help the American people understand the misinformation that they were hearing from the former president. And we then made it through. We made it through ultimately, of course, the inauguration. But even when the election was certified, as it turned out, our job was not done.
You cannot imagine what it was like in those months when finally, as one of the governors said to us, and we work with governors and state AGs, secretaries of state, election officials, law enforcement, as we've mentioned, really hundreds of folks across the country. There was someone they could call. The cavalry had arrived, but we thought when we finally reached the end of those 20-hour days and hundreds of calls and just the intensely hard work of providing that support, we thought, okay, we'll go back to our regular gigs, Joanna, to running the AG's office in Massachusetts for AG Healy, where, as you've heard, she was the pilot. And because the AGs work together nationally, the work that Joanna did was not just Massachusetts. She organized these enormous national, helped organize and often led these enormous national coalitions fighting Trump. And I thought I would go back to my regular gig as a speaker, recurring speaker in the big tent. But we were in for another surprise, not a pleasant one, and that is that the what we had seen in the election season metastasized after January.
And that included, of course, continued lies and misinformation about the election from Trump and his allies across the country, an insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, voter suppression bills introduced in nearly every state across the country, and a trend of fake election audits, not real audits, but attempts to continue to undermine the results well after the election in places like Arizona, which we'll talk more about. And, in short, the anti-democracy forces really hadn't stopped. And our states came to us and they said, we're going to need you to continue. And so we decided to make this little project a permanent organization. And we officially, in March of 2021, launched the States United Democracy Center and States United Action, which is our C4. And we've continued in this lane, this narrow but deep lane that Norm described, of supporting state officials and local officials who are on the front lines, remain on the front lines of a battle. And we like to call ourselves not just a think tank, but an action tank. So we really give these leaders the resources that they need. One of the first things we did, just as an example, as States United, was to gather a group of state leaders, current and former, completely bipartisan, many of them governors, state attorneys general, secretaries of state, to call on the business community to take action on voting rights. And that really leads nicely into a point that I want to make that's really critical about our organization, which is that we are a truly bipartisan organization. Norm mentioned that Christy Todd Whitman is a fellow co-founder and co-chair of our board, but we have so many other incredible partners who are on our bipartisan advisory board, which we've had from the very beginning. In fact, I see one of them, I'm sorry if there are others, but I see one of them on this Zoom, which is Greg Brower, former U.S. Attorney in Nevada, former high-level official in both the Department of Justice and the FBI, and so many others like Greg, who are former federal and state leaders from both sides of the aisle who advise us in every aspect of our work. We also work with, among our current state leaders, Republicans and Democrats alike. And we've seen in this election and in its aftermath, I think, just an incredible showing of leadership from state and local officials who've stood up, who've put country over party, and who have truly, stood up for democracy. We focus our work at States United in 3 lanes. And Maggie, I don't know if the slide, if you can move to the next slide. This is our advisory board, which I just mentioned. Just a few examples of the folks who are on it. We can put the link to the full board in the chat. But we focus on three areas. So election protection, which is what we've done now for so many months. It was our first area of focus and where we began. And then 2 other areas that have grown from that work. And the first is what we call accountability for democracy violators. So how do we hold accountable the people who've stepped so far outside the bounds of our democracy? How do we ensure that there's deterrence for those acts? And that's an area in which we work very closely with state attorneys general and others. And then political violence, which is really about countering this moment of domestic violent extremism in the United States, and sort of everything that led to the insurrection on January 6th, everything that flows from it, and trying to make sure that the upcoming elections in 2022 and 2024 are as safe and accessible as possible. Just to give you some examples of sort of what the last few months have looked like for us after making it through the election, and dealing with the new threats that we see across the country. One area that we've spent a ton of time on is exposing these fake election audits. You've probably read about the one in Arizona run by the cyber ninjas. You can't really make this stuff up. We began our work there and really have, in so many different ways, attacked that audit, exposed it for the sham that it is, told the story of what's going on, leveraged bipartisan election experts like the former Secretary of State of Kentucky, a lifelong Republican, to write reports, to write op-eds, to tell the story of what this means, what it is, what it isn't, working with local officials on the ground, like Secretary of State Katie Hobbs, like the Maricopa County Recorder, also a lifelong Republican, someone who voted for Trump himself and who has had the bravery, Stephen Richard, to speak up and tell the truth. And with our incredible sister organizations, we also launched a fun website, which you should check out, called notanaudit.com, which tracks the proliferation of these fake audits across the country, and again, explains what this is about. It's about misinformation. It's about continued lies about the election. It's about undermining public confidence in our elections and ultimately discouraging people from accessing their fundamental freedom to vote. Norm, I'll turn it to you to talk for a minute about the election subversion focus kind of writ large.
One of the most important but most neglected, we found, aspects of the voter suppression wave was the effort for partisan state legislatures to seize power over elections. Voter suppression has been a part of elections in the United States since the very first vote was cast. But this is something different, something that we haven't seen since the very worst days of post-Reconstruction Jim Crow, which is the wholesale ability to get the power, which in the worst case would allow these partisan state legislatures to accomplish what Trump could not accomplish in 2020, which is to flip the outcome of an election. So we really took the lead nationally. We've had success in doing this, in sounding the alarm that in the chaos of voter suppression, there's something different and ominous that is going on. And today, with the big announcement in Washington from Majority Leader Schumer that there's a deal among the Democrats, including Senator Manchin, we think there's going to be federal legislation. We've been very involved. You see one of our many op-eds here and one of our reports on this, very involved in sounding the alarm. And when state and local officials see this happening, they now know they can come to us. For example, we're representing not only states, not only governors, secretaries of states, AGs, but county officials like El Paso County in litigation to fight this terrible voter suppression and election subversion wave.
So Maggie, next slide. Just a final example of our work. I mentioned holding democracy violators accountable, addressing the political violence we're seeing across the country, of course, aimed not just at voters at our democratic institutions, but also increasingly at election officials. And that's something we would definitely love to talk more about. We've been focused on different ways to counter that, different ways to enforce the law, to provide deterrence, different ways to send a clear message that, as I said, stepping outside the bounds is unacceptable. One example is in one of the cases against Donald Trump, we filed a brief with an expert on domestic extremism to make the case that Trump really did intend to disrupt Congress's proceedings on January 6th. And again, to try to do everything we can to bolster that case. But I want to zoom out for a minute because I think, having talked a little bit about our work, for me, it's helpful to sort of look at the forest and to try to understand, this moment in our country and what's really going on here. What is the strategy? What is the anti-democracy strategy that we're responding to? Our work can be a little bit like drinking from a fire hose. We see emergencies every day in our states. We see efforts to subvert our elections and the will of American voters and taking all sorts of new shape-shifting forms. And so we've put together this slide as an attempt, and it's just an attempt to kind of map out what we think is happening here. And our view as an organization is that the anti-democracy strategy right now in America has 4 basic pillars. The first pillar, as you see here, is really about undermining public trust. So keeping the big lie alive through things like these fake audits and these election investigations, and of course, an ongoing right-wing media narrative. Why? To make people not believe in our elections, not believe in our democratic institutions, and ultimately, of course, not take advantage of the franchise. And it's successful. So the polling we've done has been certainly really sobering. In recent polls in both Pennsylvania and Arizona, we've found that about 40% of voters do not believe that President Biden won fairly. And we have our communications director, Lizzie Ulmer, on. So for the Q&A, she can answer questions about sort of where the American people are right now. But the numbers are still not good. You know, the big lie is definitely very much alive in this country. The second pillar is attacking the freedom to vote. So, you know, make people not believe and then attack the right itself. So we've seen, as you all know, hundreds of voter suppression bills across the country attacking things like vote by mail and drop boxes and prohibiting outside funding for elections. That, I think, is probably the most kind of well-covered pillar in the media, the one people are most aware of. The third, much less well-covered, is the criminalization of the opposition. So make people afraid to exercise their right, make people afraid to do the jobs of administering elections. And these are the kinds of bills we've seen that prohibit, that criminalize the provision of water at polls, or that criminalize the most routine aspects of election administration, making our local officials really terrified to do their jobs, that criminalize things like protest and ballot collection, et cetera. And then finally, the fourth pillar is what we call hijacking our elections. So Norm alluded to this when he talked about election subversion, but these are bills that really channel power over elections from trusted officials who've always done this work and done it in a completely nonpartisan way into the hands of partisan actors. So hyper-partisan state legislatures, most commonly. But it's also things like dark money groups coming in to fund these fake audits across the country. And of course, political violence is also on some level about taking over our elections. And Norm, I think you should talk about the pro-democracy strategy, our plan to attack this, because of course, that is absolutely critical.
It would be a mistake for us, and we don't, of course, operate alone. We work with hundreds of folks, government officials across the country, but we do that in alliance, in an ecosystem of many other wonderful groups, filling this narrow but deep lane that really hadn't been filled before, providing support and leverage to those officials. It would be a mistake in doing that work only to defend, as important as defense is. So the other thing that we're always cognizant of, and we really try to balance this every day in the work that we do, is the affirmative strategy to secure voting and to advance democracy, not just to hold on to push to new ground. We can talk more about it in the Q&A, which is about 60 seconds away. Enhancing public trust by building bipartisan coalitions like the wonderful advisory committee who you saw, expanding the freedom to vote by promoting federal and state expansion, like our reports on the beneficial effect that the legislation, the latest version of which was just announced today in Washington, will have across the country. We broke it down state by state by state. You can see that on our website, holding those naughty violators accountable. And we're going to talk about that. There's some good Q&A coming for that. But we have done a lot around the country to make sure, for example, that if lawyers are violating ethics rules, that they are held accountable for that. And finally, you have to protect elections and access by working on things like redistricting, pre-election day, election day, and post-election, which is what we did in 2020. We've kind of worked out the formula. So there is a pro-democracy plan.
So we just threw a lot at you. This is our contact information. We would love to be in touch anytime. And Sue, I think I'll turn it back to you to open it up for questions.
Okay, I think let's just start with voting legislation. You've touched on some of this and you've probably answered parts of these questions, but I'll just give you all the questions that have come in so far. What is the deadline for passing federal voting legislation? When will it be too late to overcome all these state laws? These laws open up new challenges for local election officials who have to pivot at the whim of new voting laws. Once they've made adjustments, isn't there a time when they can't pivot back? And will the For the People Act address the fraudits, or do we need additional legislation? I think that's it, but there may be more.
Well, the deadline was yesterday. I'm sorry to say we're past the time that would have been ideal, but we're not yet at the time that is too late. We're in the zone now. That's there's a wonderful saying that one of my family members who Austrian survived the Holocaust. I think it actually comes from, Karl Kraus. The situation is critical, but is not serious. So we're in that critical red zone offense for democracy now. They're rushing in Congress to move something. Senator Manchin announced that he's on board today. He really structured this compromise. He released the details of a compromise. And I believe that, and I'll pass to Joanna in a moment to add, if you take redistricting, that there's still a ferment around redistricting. It is not too late for some of the good measures that are in the bill to cut off the worst of these atrocities. And yes, there is a strong anti-election subversion component. We've written about it. We've advocated publicly for it. You're going to see, we believe, you're going to see some strong pushback on the worst of the misbehavior when this package is released. Joanna?
No, I mean, I think that covers it. It has been really critical for the legislation to take account of the newest anti-democracy developments across the country, and we're hopeful that it will. But of course, more is going to need to be done. And in the meantime, we focus on the state and local leaders who, are just really struggling. And we actually published a report, which Hank or Maggie can put in the chat, about the ways in which the prior version of the legislation, although many of these provisions remain the same, would actually make a difference in our states. So this would be a huge game changer for the work that we do. It's absolutely, as Norm said, critical, and it can't come too soon. We see the repercussions of the failure to address voting rights and representative democracy in this country in what happened, for example, with SB 8 in Texas. When we have gerrymandered state legislatures that don't represent the will of the American people, where 60 or 70% of the American public supports the freedom to choose, supports Roe, and yet a bill like SB 8 passes. I like to say that voting rights are reproductive rights. Voting rights are every kind of right. Everything else flows. So we'll continue to advocate, and yeah.
For those who are wondering, wait a minute, how are we going to get this wonderful federal legislation that guarantees the right to vote, deals with redistricting, that has some remedies for big money in politics, that pushes back on what we call election subversion? How are we going to get all that despite the filibuster? We're going to put in the chat. I just have, in my Brookings capacity, I just today with the leading scholar of the filibuster, Norm Ornstein, we call ourselves the Ethical Norms. We thought it would be an excellent name for a rock band, but instead we write papers. Norm Ornstein and I have written in the Post today, and we have a big Brookings report out. Hank will put those in the chat for you. The 7 reasons to believe that there's going to be filibuster, not elimination, modification and most likely an exception for voting rights. It is not a prediction that it will happen, but there's a lot of evidence. And I think the conventional wisdom and the hopelessness, I heard so much of it in my Twitter feed today after I issued these pronouncements, although Senator Schumer very conveniently made his announcement within hours of the release of our Brookings report and of our Washington Post op-ed. I know there's a lot of skepticism and even pessimism about that. So we muster all the evidence to the contrary. That's not to say for sure it'll happen, but there's a lot of reasons to believe that Senator Manchin wouldn't have spent the past 6 months in this elaborate negotiation, this big announcement today, to set himself and his caucus up to fail. You know, we might like to see filibuster reform. Joanna referred to our thesis that voting rights are women's rights and women's rights are voting rights. Our thesis that this distortion of democracy that has happened creates terrible policy that a minority foist on the rest of us. But the flip side is also true. If we can get democracy healthy again, then that will help restore so many other things that are so deeply important to us. So it might be nice to have a broader elimination of the filibuster. I personally favor that. I don't think that's happening. They've built, the way the Senate works, they've built a huge scaffolding to do this tiny exception. That is the most likely outcome. Sue, have we answered all the questions in the first cluster?
Enough. I have a related question. We have at least 2, maybe more people on the call from West Virginia. What advice can you give to them for messaging to their senator? Thanking him, nudging him? What should they do?
This would be excellent. I think I better do this in my personal capacity. I don't think I'm going to speak in a States United capacity. And then Joanna can do the same as a citizen and a voter. This would be an excellent time to thank him for this compromise, not to get out in front of our skis on the filibuster issues or, you know, demands. He's worked very hard. He's out there hunting for Republican partners. I don't think he's going to get too many of them. It will be a number larger than -1, but only slightly. But this is a good time to thank him. He's worked very, very hard. And when the details of the compromise come out, folks will see, you know, it goes well beyond his initial 2 pages of his initial 2-page outline and is really a very substantial package. It's so widely speculated in Washington that it'll contain voter ID, which is a sine qua non for Republicans, but the West Virginia form of voter ID, which is, you know, a piece of mail. And if you don't have a piece of mail, bring a friend who'll vouch for you and you can vote. You did not provisional ballot, a vote. So that's a acceptable form of voter ID. So that I think, just in my personal capacity, that I think is, this is a good period for thank yous. Whatever you're doing, West Virginians, it's working. Sue, is your sister on?
Yep, she's
She
one of
went over
them.
too. Very good.
Okay, maybe Lizzie might be able to take, we have some communications questions. Both relate actually indirectly to the Joe Manchin issue. How are you communicating your message to the Fox audience? And is there a way to message to change people's minds about the big lie?
Lizzie will answer those questions, and however she's communicating to the Fox audience, it's been very effective, judging from the number of death threats that I get on a daily basis. Lizzie?
I want to introduce Lizzie. Lizzie Ulmer is our communications director. She's been with us since the very beginning. She is the best in the business and really has done an amazing job of leveraging bipartisan voices, and our communication strategy is the same. across the board, whether it's trying to reach Fox News watchers or whether it's trying to reach others in this country. I want to just say, and I think you all know this, but the level of engagement in this group in particular, huge shout out to the friends in West Virginia. So absolutely fantastic, and also a total anomaly in this country right now. The polling that we've seen time and time again shows that so many Americans right now are really disaffected. They are not interested in voting rights. They are not interested in democracy. They do not understand the momentous nature of this moment. And so thank you all for being engaged in the way that you are. One thing I just want to say, so that we mention it, if we don't get to it at some point, is to really continue to spread the message of what's going on, to talk with friends and family, in addition to writing to your members of Congress, and think about supporting a state or local official near you, or if not in your state, if your state's not at risk, think about a sister state. We would be happy to talk more about the amazing state leaders we work with. But Lizzie can paint the fuller picture, and she can talk about the amazing strategy she's developed and executed on for so many months.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. So I'll start just with a little bit of additional background or context that Norm and Joanna have both touched on about where we are as a country on this issue. So a couple of things are definitely true. People tend to only care about voting when it comes time for them to actually pick up a ballot or cast a ballot. So we're operating in an environment where there's a lot of misinformation and there isn't necessarily the attention and focus. And from the polling and research that we've done, and from some of the incredible work of some of our partners in the research we've been able to have access to and see, we know that state and local officials are the most trusted officials on this issue, and that bipartisan voices, particularly Republican voices, are particularly important. So when it comes to our communication strategy and how we at States United and many of our partners use that to our advantage, is we make sure in all of our communications and all of our efforts, we are putting those bipartisan state and local voices first and foremost. And that has a difference. And we are making sure to meet people where they are and communicate with messages that resonate with them. So I actually saw in the chat, I can use this as an example, a question about, aren't these, bad faith election reviews that are happening in the states about fundraising? That's definitely part of the strategy of the anti-democracy group, is to be able to raise money, to be able to send fundraising emails, and to really motivate their base. But what we found from our research is that people don't necessarily care as much about the fact that these are fundraising efforts as they do about the fact that the 2020 election was already certified by trusted local election officials, by the fact that they lack transparency, and that they create election security risks that might cost the taxpayers millions of dollars. So we lead with those messages because those are things that we've learned that they resonate more with them than, say, talking about the fundraising side of it, because that's just politics to people, and people are, as we know, pretty turned off by politics right now. So that's one example of ways in which we really use the bipartisan voices we have to help insert the truth into the narrative, especially for viewers of places like Fox News and others. And it's not an easy effort, and it's not something, it's very much an uphill battle because of where we know the general electorate is on these issues, but we are seeing progress being made, and we are seeing more local and state officials being willing to come out and really stand up for the truth and be brave about that. Just last week in Wisconsin, there was a conservative state representative who held an informational hearing because she's fed up with all the threats and all the nonsense and all the misinformation. And being able to elevate that and thank her for doing that is really important, because we know based on what they're facing, it's not easy. So that's a really important leading part of the communication strategy on how to reach, the Fox News viewer. I also think another thing that we haven't really touched on here, that we're looking into and working with others on, is that humor tends to work. When we get into conversations with people and things get really tense, everything is really serious right now in this world. The way that Sue led off the call was a great, reminder of all the different things they're facing, but humor tends to help people take off their armor. So we've been looking at research and thinking about how we can incorporate things that really let people, relax a little bit and have fun with these things, because it tends to reach people a little bit better. So I think finding ways to not, to be a little humorous, to make these things feel really familial. We joke around a lot that one of the best things we found during the election was when you talk about election workers and you talk about them as your friend Doug from church. It really made people like less combative about it. And it was a very funny, fun way to talk about those things. So I think that that's really a really interesting and worth continuing to explore, is how humor can help play into the messaging strategy, at least. And then I'll say one other thing. The third thing is educating and keeping the pressure on the press. The media play a huge role, both the conservative media and the mainstream media, on this issue, and holding their feet to the fire on not falling into the trap of two-sidesism, or that this is a Republican issue, or this is a Democrat issue, or this is just what Republicans are doing and this is just what Democrats are doing, is critically important to where we are. And I would say that the press and the media did a very, very, very good job under, very unprecedented circumstances this fall and immediately after the election. And they've fallen off track a little bit lately. So there's a lot of work that's happening behind the scenes to keep pressure on editors, to help keep the pressure on reporters, those editors, those people that are on TV, to keep the good work up, to push them to cover this as it should be, as opposed to just Democrats versus Republican and really anti-democratic forces versus everybody else.
Thanks, Lizzie. There are basically three, well, I'll call it two big questions left, but they're big questions. And they are, one is the Supreme Court and one relates to Texas. So I'll just start with these three sort of unrelated Supreme Court questions, but they're all related somehow. And the first Supreme Court question is your thoughts on expanding the Supreme Court and if that's possible. Second is, can you sort of discuss the increasing use of the shadow docket and what that means for cases going forward? And the third Supreme Court one has to do with Justice Kavanaugh. Is there anything to the fears that, well, we know that a lot of complaints were suppressed. Can that lead to anything actually happening? Could he be removed from the court? Yeah,
So
I'll just leave that.
expanding shadow docket and the impeachment of Kavanaugh. No, I have a lot of leftover impeachment skills. I got to use them on somebody. Joanna, why don't I take a whirl at those, and then you can share, or Lizzie can share insights. So in terms of expanding the court, this was part of the argument that I made in the post today. There is an internal logic to how Congress operates and how the Senate operates. It's not really apparent from the outside. I've been going there and working on cases for 30 years. If they were going to expand the Supreme Court, they would have needed to lay the infrastructure to do it, I believe, some time ago. The way we've been building the infrastructure for a filibuster modification for voting rights. The part of the reason for that, and that's not to say that I oppose expanding the Supreme Court personally. I do not. I don't think States United has a view on it. So I think it is, and then there's the tyranny of the election cycle. Basically, whatever you want to do in Congress as a new president, you got to do it that first year. And so we'll see how the filibuster battle, for sure, Supreme Court expansion would be filibustered. And I don't think that there's been a very gradual process of bringing the Democrats along to support voting rights. I think, but for the extreme and outrageous behavior of the voting suppressors, that you might not have the predicate to do it. It's been so outlandish, these new Jim Crow plans, so nakedly racist. As much as I might like to see it, I just don't think there's enough ramp to do it in this Congress. That's not to say that it might not be done in a later one. This is all speculation. It could happen depending how the filibuster. I personally don't believe the filibuster is just going to be chucked out the window. I don't think Manchin and Sinema will go for that. I think they're going to do the tiniest exception possible to pass this bill that Manchin compromised on. The shadow docket, I'll say more briefly. But the good thing about the voting emphasis is, you live to survive another day, and then you have another Congress where you can kind of reboot. And then maybe the big thing we do in the next Congress is Supreme Court expansion. I think if this abortion decision, which brings us to the shadow docket, if the use of the shadow docket to tacitly overrule Roe v. Wade, there's no way you cannot give a stay if you believe in Roe v. Wade or you believe in stare decisis in precedent. I mean, it just, this bill is flatly unconstitutional. So the use of the shadow docket is also an outrage. I do think that there's a need, and Congress does have some power. It would be constitutionally questionable. Could Congress eliminate the shadow docket, control the shadow docket, require opinions to be written? I think they probably could. We should have a code of ethics in the Supreme Court. There is no code of ethics. It's literally the only body of the federal government you can do what you want. That's point number two. Point number three, Kavanaugh's not going to get impeached. It's terrible that the White House was allowed to. There was a big constant people were calling me when I was there. You're there to do impeachment, impeach Kavanaugh. Not happening unless there's some powerful evidence, even more powerful evidence of his harassment. Again, I don't think he belongs on the court. I was very outspoken at the time, and I still am. But that's just not going to happen. We do need reform of how whistleblower information is treated. Anyhow, that's the answer to the three questions. Joanna?
No, let's keep going, Sue. I think there were some questions about Texas. Is that right?
Oh, but I'm actually going to add to them. So I'm going to give you 3 topics, and you have 3 minutes to talk about all 3 of them. Texas, California recall, and the September 18th rally. Can you do that 1 minute each?
I'll just say a word about Texas. I know there were some questions about the posture of the case. Is there still a chance for SB 8 to be nullified? The answer is yes. It may not be as quick a timeline as any of us would like. It was a total game changer and a fantastic thing that the Department of Justice filed its complaint. Litigants can also ask for emergency relief, which is to say an order stopping the implementation of the law, an injunction. And I'm hopeful. They have a great judge in Texas who actually held the case originally. As I'm sure you know, what went up to the Supreme Court was in part sort of a procedural issue, and being able to have now this looked at on the merits by this judge. And there's other claims that could be brought against the law by other entities as well. So the story is definitely not over. It was obviously a devastating decision for so many of us who care about reproductive freedom in this country, but the fight continues. And as I said earlier, the need to fight these gerrymandered state legislatures continues, which is why I really urge all of you to stay so engaged on the issue of voting rights, which lead to everything else that we care about. Norm, I'll let you take, Sue, what was the second one?
Recall, California recall. Well, I think that even with all of our skepticism about polling, the margins are so wide for Governor Newsom that there would have to be some even new and larger collapse of polling methodology for the outcome to be that he is recalled. And it is I'm not afraid of democracy, including direct democracy. We'll see if my faith is acquitted or not shortly.
And how about the September 18th rally protesting the jailing of the January 6th terrorists, whatever you call them?
I can say a word about the approach we take. It's not the first rally that has been planned or announced. It's not the first one that's happened in the year that we've been doing our work. We focus on organizing leaders in law enforcement. We have many of the most prominent leaders on our advisory board: the head of the major city chiefs of police, the policing experts who led Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force, former U.S. attorneys, state AGs, of course, chief law enforcement officers for their states. And really what we've been about is focusing on training law enforcement to respond in this moment. It is an unprecedented moment. These threats against election officials, something we have not seen like this before in this country. These kinds of rallies, obviously escalating rhetoric. And what we do as an organization is to really try to educate law enforcement and to help them have the resources they need to do their jobs in this moment. But Norm, you should add anything you want to that.
Well, the threat, it's a suitable epigram for our latest wonderful gathering under the big tent. The threats to democracy aren't going away. I think it's safe to say there'll be massive force available if anything like January 6th is tried again. For that reason, it probably won't be attempted again, but the threat to democracy isn't going away, and that's why States United is not going away. We didn't think, as you heard, we didn't think we would still be here. Has been a seismic change in how politics is being done, asymmetrical dysfunction and misconduct in how politics is being done. There are many heroes also, though, on the GOP side. If it weren't for GOP heroes, the 2020 election would not have been saved, whether it was election officials, governors, secretaries of state, judges nominated by the former president. So the threat's not going away. The need for bipartisan coalition is all the more important. We're not going away either. And we hope you'll have us back under the big tent soon to update you on our work so we can catch up with all of you. It's always such a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for welcoming us.
Thank you for having us. My email's in the chat. Please be in touch.
Okay, Joanna and Norm and Lizzie, thank you so much for talking with us tonight. I know I sleep better at night knowing you guys are out there working to keep our democracy safe. And we have a Big Tent survey that's being, I think, popped into the chat. It'll take 1 minute to fill it out. Please add it. Please. Oops. Oh, there it is. Okay, just please take 1 minute to fill it out. Your feedback will help us plan future events. Good night.